All right, it's official. So the Torah portion is Re'eh, which means look, see. And it starts in our Eitz Chaim Chumash on page 1061. In any other edition, it's Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 11, starting with verse 26. And this is a Torah portion with a lot of stuff in it, a lot of exhortations, and back and forth again with watch out, be faithful to God. That's better than not being faithful to God. The beginning is a very dramatic statement. Re'eh, see, look. Anochi notein lifnechem hayom bracha uklala. I am putting before you today a blessing and a curse. Now pick whichever one you want. Right? So it's up to you. And then the continuation, which we may or may not look at. And then the idea of choosing to follow God is mentioned, as I say, again and again and again. Part of that, I talked a little bit in Torah Sparks about Moses' continuing worry that once Israel gets into the promised land, they will start being influenced by the neighboring cultures. And besides all the exhortations, don't, there are numerous places in Devarim, especially where Moses says, destroy all of the places of idol worship. And these are always difficult texts for us today, where we feel like it should be live and let live. But this is part of the content of Re'eh. I've talked about it other times, written about it. Anyway, so that keeps on going, and then we have one of the features of Deuteronomy, which is the insistence on one central shrine. That and that's one of the things that actually is contrasted between serving God and the idols. With idols, every tree, every rock, every place, every town had their own idol. Everything could be a place where you could worship whatever idol you wanted. And then Moses says, but not for God. God is one God, and therefore there's one shrine, and everybody has to go to the same shrine, to the same sanctuary. Of course, as we know, the sanctuary is never told to us where that's going to be. It finally finds itself to be Jerusalem, but that takes a while, and that's way later. But here, there's this unnamed central sanctuary that we're all supposed to be committed to. At the very end of the Torah reading, we have the 3 pilgrimage festivals, where it doesn't matter where you live, you're supposed to show up and come to the shrine to see and be seen. But in the middle here, we have the idea that what happens if you're too far away? What happens if you really can't come to the shrine? So what are you supposed to do? So the Torah doesn't say, well, set up, congregation Shomrei Emunah in Montclair, and use that as your backup plan, and you go to Jerusalem, only for the Hajj. But rather, what the Torah says is there are certain leniencies or certain extra provisions, dispensations that the Torah gives us. So, for instance, until the dispensation is given here, if you wanted to eat meat, you could only eat meat by sacrificing the animal on the altar, giving God a little piece of the meat, and then the rest of the meat could be yours. And in this Torah reading, we finally read, no, but if you're too far away, Bernardo, look at that. Great to have you. Welcome. So I hope you can hear us. So anyway, so the permission is given here that you don't sacrifice anywhere else. That's always forbidden, but you're allowed to slaughter the animal. And as long as you don't eat the blood, as long as you pour out the blood and return it to the earth, you're able to eat the animal without a sacrifice. So this is like a big concession that the Torah makes here. The other big concession that the Torah makes is that you can exchange the tithing that needs to be eaten in Jerusalem. So you're supposed to bring 2 out of the 3 years of a cycle. You're supposed to bring a tithe to Jerusalem. It's called Maaser Sheni, and eat your produce in Jerusalem, in the sanctuary. I mean, in the in the central place. And the Torah says, well, what if you're too far away? By the time you bring the food to the sanctuary, it'll be rotten. It'll be spoiled. So they say, okay, so you know what? You can redeem it for money, and then bring the money to the shrine, and then buy food from the local farmers and the local stores. So that's another kind of leniency that takes place, where we have the interesting concept of what money can do. That money actually can stand in and change. Be a medium of exchange, not just exchange between two people, but exchanging the identity of what the money represents. So all of that is in here too. What else is there? There's a lot. So then we have the whole problem of various ways that people might try to lead us astray. So we have, what do we do about somebody who starts a movement, to whether as a prophet or whether as just a secret, agitator who's just talking to his own little family or her own little circle of friends? What happens if a city becomes completely overwhelmed by idolatrous influence? What are you supposed to do with those places? You're supposed to wipe them out. So that's not just idol worship of the Canaanite peoples, but within Israel itself, the command is to make sure that that any Israelite idol worship is wiped out. So that's another thing. By now we're up to page 1072. We've gotten through half of the Torah reading. So there's a lot of stuff here. There are a lot of various short sections of laws. Kashrut is a section that is dealt with in Re'eh. And again, like I said, Maaser, the tithing. And then in chapter 15, 1076, we have a long section, relatively, about the 7th year, Shemitah, the Shnat HaSheva, Shnat HaShemitah, the 7th year. And here, this is a topic that has been dealt with before. It's dealt with in Exodus, and it's dealt with in Leviticus. And here, in Deuteronomy, there's an extra piece that's added, and this is economic Shemitah. This is the cancellation of loans. So the whole question of trying to look out for poor people. So that's all taken care of here. Then we have on 1079, we've got the question of how to deal with slaves, freeing slaves, and also taking care of slaves who don't want to be free. So that's an interesting scenario. And then we're finally coming to the end of the Torah reading. And we have the idea of what animals are eligible for sacrifice and when are they eligible for sacrifice. And then finally, the 3 pilgrimage festivals is the last section. So there's a ton of stuff here, a lot of stuff. I think that the traditional count, I'll look it up for a second. The traditional count for Re'eh is something like 50-something commandments. Wrong. I was wrong. Yeah. 55 commandments. 17 positive commandments and 38 negative commandments. So a lot. One of the more numerous sets of commandments is in Re'eh. Okay, so I gave you the whole review. Now, what are we going to land on? I mean, we've looked at some of these things, obviously, in previous years. How about if we look at let's look. How about if we look at the internal scenarios of when there are people within the Jewish people who want to become idolaters and influence other people. How's that? All right, 1068. Starting from the top of the page, verse 29. This is Shlishi, the third Aliyah. So it's chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, verse 29. Who's going to read for us? Come on. Thank you, Sarita.
I read last week. I'll read again unless someone else wants to. Okay, 29. When the Lord your God has cut down before you the nations that you are about to enter and dispossess, and you have dispossessed them and settled in their land, beware of being lured into their ways after they have been wiped out before you. Do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did those nations worship their gods? I too will follow those practices. You shall not act thus toward the Lord your God, for they perform for their gods every abhorrent act that the Lord detests. They even offer up their sons and daughters in fire to their gods.
Okay, so that's the introductory part about how abhorrent and terrible idol worship is. And sometimes we think about idol worship as an issue of it's an insult to God to worship something that's not God. Right? That it's a mistake. Philosophically, it's a mistake. Theologically, it's a mistake. It's wrong. You're supposed to worship God, not something else. But here, there's an extra feature, an extra element about what God actually is really disgusted by. What is it that God is really angry about when it comes to idolatry? Anybody?
Well, they specifically mentioned child sacrifice.
Right. Yeah. And it says they perform for their gods every abhorrent act. And then child sacrifice is given as a as a signal example of that. So this is the Torah giving a rationale, right? It's not that God just simply wants you to get the answer on the test correct. Who's the correct God to worship? It's the moral revulsion that these cults or these religious systems went into all kinds of terrible practices, and you can leave it to your own imagination. What might be the other, besides child sacrifice? What else might be a part of their practices? Famous is fertility cults and different kinds of ceremonies for that. And of course, one of the clear connections that we have here is, well, didn't God ask Abraham to sacrifice Abraham's son to God? So what's so abhorrent? God also asked Abraham to sacrifice his son to him. So how is Deuteronomy saying that this is so terrible? Nobody wants to answer.
Yeah, well, I actually I've thought about this a lot. I wrote something up actually for Kol Emunah when we got back from Peru.
Mm-hmm.
In Peru, we learned a lot about the practice of child sacrifice, and it was an honor. I mean, people offered their children to be sacrificed, and so I sort of reflected in some, when I think about Abraham, in some ways, and I thought about it. It made me feel like he actually flunked the test. That we know that there are times where people have argued with God, Abraham included, about that that's not a good thing. You shouldn't do that, and to just go along with this and not argue with God about that. I feel like, for me, as I coming back and learning so much about, hearing so much about child sacrifice, I wonder, really made me think about, oh, maybe Abraham was actually not supposed to go along with it. He was supposed to argue with God and reject it.
So the whole, we're coming up to Rosh Hashanah. Let me give everybody a heads up. And this, of course, will be one of the perennial subjects that will be dealt with on Rosh Hashanah, and and we're supposed to, try to grapple with it. And how we see Abraham is again something that we constantly wonder about. Did he do the right thing? Did he do the wrong thing? Should he? If he's a questioner, why doesn't he question at that moment? But I want to sort of skip dealing with that particular moment and broaden it a little bit more into just observing that there are a lot of things that the patriarchs and the matriarchs did that after the Torah is given, you can't do. By the lights of the Torah as we have them from Sinai, what they did was absolutely wrong. So, for instance, Jacob marries two sisters, Rachel and Leah. And we celebrate them, and we mention them in our prayers, and this is they are the matriarchs. They are the founders of the Jewish people. Once the Torah is given, it's an abomination to marry two sisters together. It's like incest. So we have a very stark change from before the giving of the Torah to after, or from patriarchal and matriarchal times to to later. Judah marries his daughter-in-law, or he doesn't marry her, but he has relations with her, and that's okay. The Mashiach is going to come from that. So things that you're not supposed to do according to the Torah happened earlier in one form or another. There are other examples right now they're not springing to mind. Another famous example. When I walk in to the shul every Shabbos morning, so I sing a melody to the words "Mano Raha Makom Hazeh." How awesome is this place? It's a beautiful, beautiful declaration by Jacob that when he wakes up in the morning from his amazing dream of the ladder going up from earth to heaven, so he says, "Wow, I didn't know God was in this place. This is the gate to heaven. This is an amazing, awesome place." And what does he do? He sets up a matzeva. He takes the stone that he put his head under, that he used as a pillow, and he sets it up standing, so it becomes like a pillar, like a monument, and that is the marker. And then he uses it as an altar to sacrifice to God in thanksgiving. Later on, actually someplace here, Moses says, "Do not ever make for God a matzeva. God hates a matzeva." So all the commentators go, "Whoa, what happened?" And that's what they point out. They point out God did not hate the matzeva in Jacob's time. By the time we get to the people of Israel observing a Torah, times have changed, and the cultures around have appropriated a matzeva for the abominations that they do, and from now on, matzeva cannot be looked at innocently anymore. You can't look at a matzeva without the associated history of the terribleness that has happened since Jacob's time. So what we see is that there are certain things that change. There are certain things that change, and they are affected by how history has developed. Everybody, when they read the Akedah story, they make a point of saying, well, what is the punchline of the Akedah story? The punchline of the Akedah story is God does not want child sacrifice. So, so whether Abraham was privy to that value judgment or not, is something else to think about. But we've got to change. By the time we get to here, things that we ourselves did now have to be evaluated differently. And that's what it means to accept the Torah as binding, is that now the Torah is telling us how to turn right or left, even though we might have, we have our own historical sense. Well, once upon a time we did this. And that, of course, is a huge question. When does history and tradition give us the leeway to make meaning in our lives, and when does history and tradition have to be overruled by certain other considerations? Huge question.
So 2 comments on that, if I may. One is when you were talking about that, it made me think about how contemporary, in some ways that sounded, about how there are some things that we don't do because other people do them. So I remember when the kids were little and I wanted to decorate the house for Hanukkah and put up lights and all that. And, Lou's comment was, oh, we don't put up lights for Hanukkah. Because, right. But I said, wait a minute, isn't this the festival of lights? So I did. In fact, I have what I call my dreidel lights, and I hung them up. I stopped doing it after a while because now that we're in the house by ourselves. But there's many. It seems to me there's many things like that. But we don't do that because people who aren't Jewish do it. So that's one thought. The other thought that I had is so you cited some examples of things that people did. And actually, there is no example of child sacrifice. Was that something that actually got done? Abraham obviously seems to have gone along with it, or the suggestion of it. It didn't actually happen, but nowhere else is there any mention of that. There's no example of somebody actually doing it. There's examples later, right, in prophets and things like that, but that's a heinous thing. But there's no example, where it was actually done.
Right. We have no other stories of that. Correct. Yeah. Right. And I think that one of the things that this text assumes is that when they say, look at this disgusting thing that they do, that they're assuming that everybody will be on the same page and go, ooh, that's pretty awful. So they're assuming that they're talking to a crowd, to a people that actually buys into that sense of abhorrence to child sacrifice. So that could lead us to another question. So since we don't really have, we have the Akedah story. We don't then have a lot of drumming into us. Don't do this child sacrifice stuff. Everybody look around. They're all doing it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. We have it here in this kind of sort of, indirect way. It never says, well, it does say, do not offer your children to Molech. Right? That's explicitly, that was some kind of idol worship of a particular idol. The Molech worship. It was some kind of fire worship. And the Torah says you can't do that. But like you say, it doesn't really say it. So how would we then imagine how this abhorrence to child sacrifice took root in the Jewish people without the explicit ongoing, prohibitions and so on? If this late, so to speak, late text can assume that everybody buys into this, everybody is accepting this value, where did the value come from? Because apparently it's not quite consensus for everybody. In the Greek traditions also, if you really need to, you offer, that's the greatest gift you can give. That's when you really, really show how faithful you are to God. If you go to war, you offer your kid. So how do we assume that this could have become so rooted in the Jewish value system? Well, you think that we take our values from the Torah itself, and I just made a whole argument. Yep, so if the Torah says it's changed, it's changed. But is that the only source of how we develop our values as a people? So I would suggest, oh, Marty, thank God you're here. Otherwise, I would have to talk. But you have to unmute yourself. Or maybe don't. You know what? Don't keep yourself muted. Talk as much as you want. We're going to keep on going. No, just kidding. You have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. You're muted. You have to push the button to make you, so we can hear you. We cannot
Marty,
hear
we can't hear you.
No. On your screen, there's a microphone thing with a line through it. You have to touch the microphone thing, the icon, to take the line away. It's at the bottom of the window. If you put your cursor at the bottom of the window, a white thing will come up. You'll see in the middle a picture of a telephone, a picture of a microphone.
Does that work with he's on the phone? He's doing it through his phone.
See him. How do you do it with a phone?
I don't know. I've never.
*6. Try star. Are you on the phone? Try *6.
Well, he's gone.
Oh, well. What can I say? Sorry. Maybe he'll come back and figure it out. I don't know. How do you do that? I don't know. All right. So Marty will have something to say, I hope, when he comes back. What I want to suggest is something very simple, which is that we have oral traditions. The written Torah doesn't come, it comes first to certain oral traditions because it becomes the basis for oral traditions that are interpretive of that written Torah. But the written Torah itself is an intermediate product, historically speaking. Here you are. All right, can you unmute?
Am I unmuted now?
Yay, you did it.
Rabbi, is it not correct? I remember in the old city, in Jerusalem rather, between Montefiore's windmill and the walls of the old city, there's the valley of Gehenna or Gehenna.
Yeah.
Isn't that where, according to Jewish tradition, people before King David came in there, that they would sacrifice children? And isn't that where the notion of child sacrifice came from and the notion of Gehenna or hell came from?
So I can't give you a full answer, but yes, that place was a place that was labeled a place where these abominations were held, and they were seen as idolatrous abominations that some people followed, and it's exactly the topic, one of the main topics. You missed the whole outline of what's in our Torah reading for this Shabbos, but that's one of the main concerns, is that Moses is saying, we just read those verses, watch out, you're going to be seduced by these practices that everybody is practicing. And yes, that valley, right? Gei Hinnom, right? The valley of Hinnom. So Gehenna was the place where people were brought to engage in these practices. Yes. But when you're bringing that up, it actually relates to what I'm talking about now, which is, I was asking, how do we get to an overall consensus that the Jewish people developed against child sacrifice if we didn't have the Torah yet, right? Because the Torah doesn't come up until later. And I was saying, because we have developed traditions, oral traditions that precede the Torah, right? People told the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob before the Torah existed. By the time Moses comes along, he's appealing to, I'm coming in the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he tells the Israelites. They know about this. They're telling stories to one another, right? So the people are the vehicle for all kinds of traditions. What you're bringing up is this very touchy question. Which traditions are the people carrying for better or for worse, right? And this is sometimes, what happens, a Kulturkampf, right? A culture war. You will have a war between different people in the same, different peoples in the same nation about what's good for the nation. We're going through one like that right here in the United States. What represents America as a great nation, right? And depending on eventually, let's say, 100 years, 1,000 years from now, people will be talking about whether or not America kept going in a certain way or went in another way. We have all kinds of discussions today about waking up to the fact that actually American tradition is deeply, prejudiced and racist. We never used to think that, right? We used to think that American tradition was a tradition of democracy and equality, imperfect, but it kept on going in that direction. So how nations develop their own sense of what their tradition is a very complicated and tricky and unstable phenomenon. So what I was suggesting was that the Jewish people developed their own tradition of disgust with child sacrifice. But what you're bringing up is the fact that not all Jewish people thought child sacrifice was disgusting. There were plenty of Jews that went along with everything else and who thought maybe, not that they were going off to become idol worshippers, but they thought this is fine for Judaism. That's what and we disagree with about these things today. What constitutes quote unquote authentic Judaism and what doesn't. Basically, there's a pretty solid consensus. Jews for Jews are not Jews. But there's no consensus beyond that. Right? Orthodox people say, are you kidding? Reform Judaism is not even Judaism. You may be a Jew because you belong biologically to the Jewish people, but as Judaism, Reform Judaism is not Judaism. I have news for you. Many Reformed Jews return the compliment. And they don't believe that old-fashioned Judaism is any good. It's an abomination. Once upon a time, forget about not observing it, but kashrut, which we have in this week's Torah reading, was spat upon by Reform Judaism. Was considered an abomination, was considered a terrible, terrible thing. So not just discretionary. You don't have to, but if you want to, that's okay. So I mentioned this in one or two contexts. I'll mention it now again. We're doing this wonderful project. I think I'm very happy with it. I mean, that we're doing it, which is that the 4 synagogues are combining for this Rosh Hashanah. There was a notice that was put out on Shomrei week that on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, Sunday, we're going to blow shofar all around town, right? Well, guess what? For most Reform communities, there is no second day of Rosh Hashanah, and they blow shofar on Shabbos. So the fact that I said we should all together join together and blow shofar on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, there was some resistance to that in the Reform shuls, because I was imposing a burden on them that they otherwise would be very happy to ignore. They don't see any problem not blowing shofar on Shabbos, and 99.9% of their congregations don't really think much about the second day. Look, we have in our own community, we have a very, very big drop-off in normal times between the first day of Rosh Hashanah and the second day. But still, at least officially, we've got it on the calendar. So there's, there are fights internally about what Judaism should look like. And then, the answer of what Judaism looks like, it depends who wins, right? History belongs to the victorious. So the people that sacrificed in the valley of Gehenna, and who thought that they were actually being good Jews, they lost.
Thank heavens.
So there seems to be,
you don't know what you were missing. The kiddush that they had was so good.
Reed, you're really off the topic, sir.
But I'm just thinking that there's something a bit different. I mean, if you think about, does Judaism allow for child sacrifice? versus does Judaism allow you to blow the shofar on Shabbat? I would just have to say that to me, and that's just me, I don't see those as equally sort of weighty kind of decisions, and
So let me just push back. Obviously, I think that there's a tremendous difference between killing people and the blowing shofar on Shabbos or not. Yes. On the other hand, for the Torah, Shabbos is do or die. And the decision that the rabbis made not to blow shofar on Shabbos was because they had the utmost reverence for the holiness of Shabbat, which is a very foreign concept to most people today. The fact that they said maybe, because this is the argument. The argument is a very stretched argument. And in the Reform movement, they just dismiss it. They go, this is stupid. But the rabbi's argument was maybe it will lead, the jokes that we always make, it'll lead to mixed dancing. That was their argument. Their argument was it could lead to the violation of Shabbat that was not a direct fulfillment of blowing shofar. They blew shofar in the temple on Shabbat. They understood that the Torah says, look, when it comes out on Shabbat, it comes out on Shabbat, like Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, if it comes out on Shabbat, it's Yom Kippur. But fasting on Shabbat is not a violation. But they were worried that it would lead to other violations of Shabbat, and they couldn't stand that idea. And they took this very extreme stance of saying Shabbat is holy, and we are not going to let anybody trip over Shabbat and desecrate Shabbat because of shofar. So we'd rather not hear shofar on Shabbat than have anybody out there violating Shabbat. That's a pretty serious consideration that they're expressing. They saw that as really non-negotiable. They saw that as something that they were, bound to honor. Shabbat is the centerpiece of the creation story and the centerpiece of their concept of what it means to be serving God and imitating God and all of that. We don't have that concept anymore, but they did. Another example of how things change over history. Right? So, yeah. All right. Let's keep going. Yeah.
Okay. I just also, so in terms of child sacrifice, we do have the Akeda, which seems to be making the point that God doesn't want this. But as I think about, what we abide by in terms of, inherently finding certain things really problematic, even though, we talked, was it last week or the week before, we talked about how some of the values, things that are not mentioned in the Torah, we do them because, right, that's we are part of a larger society, and there are certain things that society in general values. So here we have something that, was at the time, it is now part, perhaps was part of the larger society, but we should not engage in that. But my point is that, there probably are, that is mentioned. It's not dwelled on, right? It's not like we're not hit over the head with that. There's a couple of places where it's clearly mentioned or indicated that you wouldn't want that. So how do we, in that sense, know not to do something that's sort of absent? That they're right, that when there are certain things that are absent in the Torah or not mentioned a lot. That, right? I'm just trying to grapple with that.
Right. So a couple of just side points before we get to the main point that you made. We develop our own sense of right and wrong within cultures, within time periods, the zeitgeist, and so on and so forth. What we talked about last week with Rabbi Glasner's teaching, the beginning of the 20th century, is also something that wouldn't have been possible at the time of the Torah. Torah, because in the time of the Torah, what we just read, these few verses, the Torah is completely convinced that, and it's true. I mean, from my perspective, this is Judaism at its birth pangs, right? This is Judaism trying to emerge from a world where Judaism doesn't exist as a historical factor. It doesn't exist as a Judeo-Christian tradition. It doesn't exist as the mother of Islam. It doesn't exist as a respected, historical phenomenon. It doesn't exist yet. So the Torah is about fighting for a very revolutionary and new idea within a world that knows nothing about these values. That was the case on and off as things changed. But for instance, in Europe, 200 years ago, Jews were convinced that they lived in a completely corrupt and disgusting society. Right? The Goyim were drunks, they were illiterate, they were murderers, they were immoral, they were killing Jews right and left. So as far as they were concerned, anything that the Goyim did had to be wrong. But at the same time, starting in the 1300s, we have discussions where we start saying, you know what? Not all the Goyim are idol worshippers like the Torah talks about. Not all the Goyim are such terrible people, and not all of their religious values are so terrible. So that's when we slowly, first it becomes one voice, and then it becomes more, and then finally we get to today, where we can actually have a whole bunch of Jews saying, you know what? It's okay to live in this world. It's okay to respect other people. They have something to contribute to us. But that took a whole shift of millennia, for that to happen. How do we know? How do we know when? How do we know what? It's a great question. I don't know that we don't have we don't have the rules on how to decide this. I want to read actually from our Torah reading, because it does speak exactly to what you're talking about, except I have to find it. You can find it in a different edition, not in the Eitz Chaim edition. Hold on a second. Find it in my old-fashioned edition here. So it's because it says it a couple of times. Now I'm not finding it this way either. Well, it says V'asita hatov v'hayashar b'nei Hashem. There's a verse here in this Torah reading, in this Torah reading, it says it twice, if I'm not mistaken. And the verse says, "Do that which is hatov v'hayashar b'nei Hashem." Do that which is good and honest or just or straight in the eyes of God. So Nachmanides says this is one of the catch-all verses in the Torah. He says the Torah cannot give you every tiny little thing that will ever come up in life, in any time, in every place in the world. It can't give you a completely detailed, granular guide for every single question that will come up. And therefore, what the Torah simply says is, look, in the end, you have to ask yourself, is this what God would want? Like the way many Christians go, is this what Jesus would do? Is this how Jesus would behave? And that's the same thing that the Torah is saying. Do that which you can be convinced of, or at least struggle with saying, is this what would be good in God's eyes? Now, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. This is a presupposing I'm serving God every day. I'm studying God's Torah all the time. I'm trying to be close to God. What I wrote about in the Torah Sparks, I'm trying to know God. I'm trying to develop a relationship with God. So then, based on that relationship, you hope that you develop what we call today a moral compass. right? You hope that you develop some set of values, and also that you develop a kind of a nose, right, for what smells right and what smells wrong, what smells off. And that's the training that the Torah is supposed to give you, so that then you go into uncharted territory. You won't be completely bereft. That's the traditional answer that's given. Now, of course,
I found them. They're both. One is on page 1067. After talking about,
I have my page right here, and it's on the last line, and I couldn't see it.
right, it's on verse 25. This is talking about, going back to 23, but make sure you do not partake of the blood, for the blood is the life, and you must not consume the life with the flesh. You must not partake of it. You must pour it out on the ground like water. You must not partake of it in order that it may go well with you and with your descendants to come, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of the Lord.
Now go down to verse 28.
Right. Be careful to heed all these commandments that I enjoin upon you. Thus it will go well with you and with your descendants after you forever. For you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God.
There it is.
Yeah.
So that's the idea. So that's the idea. But that's the translation is, again, one of these funny kinds of translations. But yes, that's the translation. That's the source. And it's said a number of places elsewhere. So that's the general thing. After a while, you sort of develop a sense for it. And we have different prophets to say the same thing. What does Micah say? Higid lecha ben adam ma tov. God told you what's good, right? And this is all God wants from you, right? Right? Ki asot mishpat v'ahavat chesed v'hatznei alechet im Hashem Elokecha. Do justice, love loving, and walk humbly with your God. That's all. And Moses has said also, all God wants from you is to do that which is just and that which is right. And this is repeated again and again and again. Of course, so what's right? What's just? In this particular case, what's right? The answer is you have to struggle with it. But to use a phrase that is so, to me, so relevant to this, at the end, when we talk about Shemitah, we have the question of the poor people, and the Torah says this is 15:7. You got it?
Yeah.
Please.
If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen in any of your settlements in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman.
Right. So that's the hardening the heart and the shutting the hand. So this is a major theme throughout the book of Deuteronomy. What's going on in your heart? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, right? With all your soul, with all your mind. Look into your heart. And this is, in the end, coming back to, Hillel's guideline, right? Is this the way you would want to be treated? Think about what is is distasteful or painful to you. Is that okay to do that to anybody else? Look in your heart. How would it feel? So the Torah is supposed to be getting us to work on our hearts, and then whether we actually do it or not is up to us. Let's we were
Page 1078.
Thank you. No, that's there. But we were looking earlier.
Oh, right. We were, yeah. No, I was just looking because in Shomrei week, I put an announcement about a panel discussion that'll be the August 25th, reclaiming Jewish social justice. The poor of your town come first.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a
And-
statement from the Talmud.
Yeah.
How do you balance? How do you prioritize? If the world is so full of problems, how do you actually make the decisions again, what's right?
Yeah.
But you know what? All right, if we're on 1078, what the heck? Let's read that page. We have
Now I
a
have
couple
to turn
minutes.
back.
We have a couple
Okay.
minutes. Sorry.
All right. So 1078 starting from.
10 from 1077, the bottom. Go ahead, do it again.
Okay. So we had, if, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen in any of your settlements in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you must open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. Beware lest you harbor the base thought, the seventh year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kinsman and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will incur guilt. Give to him readily, and have no regrets when you do so. For in return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and in all your undertakings. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and open your hand to the poor and needy kinsmen in your land.
Okay. So this is a pretty strong set of statements. And it's very, very conscious of the proclivities of people to be selfish and to be not just selfish, but mean-spirited. That's also part of what the Torah here is saying. You say it's not just enough to just, okay, so abide by the rules here. But what the Torah says, I don't want you to be closing your heart up. I don't want you to be looking at people with an evil eye. The translation that you have here of you are mean to your needy, so that you're mean. Don't be mean, right? In the Hebrew, it's vera'a eincha be'achicha. Ra'a from the word evil, ra, right? That your eye will be evil. You'll give your friend an evil eye. You'll look at your friend evilly. And of course, that's part of what happens today. When we have all of the politicians who defend not helping other people, what do they say? Oh, they're rapists. Oh, they're thieves. Oh, they're violent. Oh, they're they're this and that and the other thing. That's the same thing the Egyptians said about us when we were slaves. And that justifies everything. So it doesn't matter that they're starving to death. They're not real human beings because they're ra'a incha, because the way you look at them is through this evil lens. And the Torah is trying to stop it here. We have another second, so I want to just point out a classic, important teaching. I've mentioned it other times, from Richard Elliott Friedman, who points out that verse 11, right, is translated here, for there will never cease to be needy ones in your land. Right? And then the note there says they will never cease. This realism, the realism of this verse contrasts with the ideal described in verse 4. So look at verse 4. Previous page.
4, there shall be no needy among you, since the Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion.
Right. So God is going to give us everything, and God is going to give us abundance. There won't be any needy. That's verse 4. And now in verse 11 it says there will never stop being needy people. So this is a contradiction. It's a famous contradiction. So Richard Elliott Friedman says it's not a contradiction. What verse 11 says is, don't think that the poor will disappear on their own. The word yechdal, it says here, ki lo yechdal evyon, b'kerev haaretz. The translation will be, the needy will not disappear on their own from within the land, from the midst of the land. You have to make poverty disappear. You have to have a war on poverty. You have to fight against poverty. The poverty is not going to go away if you turn away and don't look at it, which is what we constantly engage in. So what the Torah is saying is, it's about looking, right? Re'eh. It's about looking. Don't look with ra'a eincha. Don't look with evil eye. See with an open eye, and with an open heart. All right. Sei gesund. Yeshe koach.